how international funding agencies can enhance their impacts on health policy making in low and middle income countries. So the comprehensive coding framework we developed, consisting of 68 different signals and activities, could be used by a funding agency looking to identify potential areas for improvement or areas where they could further promote KT. It's important to note that funding agencies should not feel pressure to implement all possible KT signals and activities. Such decisions really need to consider the specific context, mandate, and resources available to a given funding agency. So looking forward, while our study identifies a broad range of KT signals and activities that funding agencies can employ, it does not delve into whether or not these signals and activities are actually effective, so whether or not they result in impacts on development and implementation of health policies. So future research should examine evaluations of agency KT signals and activities, and if possible, look at the success of different domains of KT signals and activities. So one day we might hope to be able to say that KT signals and activities under the domain of language and exchange are effective at achieving certain outcomes compared with more general, broader KT signals and activities that focus on the general climate for KT. So ultimately we hope that the findings of our study and the findings of research that builds in our study will contribute to a better evidence base that funding agencies can consult in determining their policies and in determining their KT signals and activities and working towards better evidence-informed policies and improved health. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks to all the previous speakers. And Lisa, I would love to chat with you later. I think our research has quite a few similarities, so really interested in continuing that discussion. So today I'm going to be speaking to you about race, gender, and foreignness as it's experienced by individual aid workers in the field. And my case study looks at Uzbekistan, and all the 4 of the 5 people that I interviewed were Canadian, 1 is from the Middle East, and the organization they came from is Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF. So the 2 questions that I had were, how do aid workers experience, like I said, their gender and race in the field, and how can this knowledge inform pre-departure training and responses to issues that do come up overseas. So I don't want to go into this too much because I have a limited amount of time, but Uzbekistan is a low-income country in Central Asia between, I think I can point at this, Afghanistan to the south and Kazakhstan to the north, and then Russia here. MSF has been in country since 1998, and the main health crisis there is tuberculosis. A lot of people struggle with multi-drug and drug-resistant forms, so it's a public health kind of long-term emergency. So looking at the literature to answer my questions was a little difficult. So in terms of the humanitarian aid research that I was finding, there seems to be kind of 3 areas that have been looked at. So from a political science perspective, there's a lot of research that looks at the interplay between state actors and non-state actors, such as NGOs as well as philanthropic organizations, and looks at the kind of accountability and lack thereof in the execution of international aid. There's also more of a practitioner point of view, which looks at minimizing unintended harm in the field and how effective interventions actually are if they do what they are meant to do or set out to do. And then there's another kind of body of research that looks at the ethics of humanitarian interventions. Is it all part of some kind of capitalist kind of keeping down of peoples? Are there elements of colonialism in it? But that's not what I was interested in looking at. So, pardon me, it seems that there isn't too much research on kind of the personal experiences of aid workers in the field, and Anne-Marie Fechter has kind of thought of why this might be. She talks about how aid workers are seen as self-sacrificial, and therefore they don't, like as a whole, it doesn't seem right to provide a lot of attention to their experiences. So I want to change that. So in the literature, I've found on migration and expatriate identity, there have been some studies that look at race and gender in the field. So one example is from Helen Harper. She talked about Canadian southern women in Canada who go and work in Native communities in the north. And this is kind of a unique example because she takes both white women as well as Indigenous women and talks about how they experience themselves in those communities. There's another study by Emily Fechter about Euro-Americans in Indonesia, but again, this struggles because it really takes white expats as the norm, whereas I know that white people aren't the only people who are going out and working overseas as mobile professionals. Again, the study looked at British white professionals in Hong Kong, but that was in the corporate workplace. So there hasn't been too much on humanitarian aid workers. In this field, I think it provides a good kind of starting point for what I'm interested in my study. But again, there is this focus on the white aid worker as if there was nothing else. And the problem with the migration literature is that when it comes to women, they look at women as homemakers, as people who accompany spouses who are actually doing the real work and or whatever, whereas they're at home. Or other studies have looked at femininity and how that changes when Western women go into the field, accompanying their husbands, and how that seeing other forms of femininity affects themselves. So we're really lacking professional women experiences. There's also the moral stress concept. So this originally was developed for nursing, but later was applied to humanitarian workers and has a high degree of salience because humanitarian aid workers also deal with additional stressors than you would find in domestic nursing, such as war and violence, a lack of health infrastructure, which Lisa was talking about this morning. So my hope in my research was to look more at how culture and that unfamiliarity with a new culture and that displacement to a new culture will affect aid workers, rather than focusing on experiences in the workplace. So I found in the moral stress literature that the main focus is on moral stress that arises in the context of the job, so in fulfilling job duties, but I'm interested in stress that might occur outside the workplace, in the streets, on your weekends, at the market, things like that, because I think those are part of being a foreigner, being overseas, living overseas in a new location. And I don't think that the moral stress literature gives us enough, like it could go further in terms of talking about race and gender because it doesn't really delve too deeply into that. So my interviews with the 5 individuals from MSF, which came from a wide variety of professional profiles, yielded the following kind of main points. I can't get into everything because it's just a short presentation, but a key finding is that moral stress does happen outside the workplace. So in Uzbekistan, there's a practice called bride kidnapping. It sounds really bad, but it's not always bad. Well, not to put value judgments. So basically what happens is that sometimes a man will kidnap his wife as a way to start a marriage. And sometimes this is because the parents don't agree with it, but they love each other. Other times not. occasionally, or who knows how often, it's actually a consensual thing. But people who go to Uzbekistan and see this sometimes find it really discomforting. As Terry says, it's just totally humiliating for the women. And we see this with some of my other respondents as well. They have a hard time reconciling this. So this was Vincent, who is a doctor. In another country, I would not be standing idly by, because this woman is screaming and making a huge deal of it. So that was really uncomfortable for him. Key findings in terms of race and gender. Sometimes people will experience things differently. So a woman isn't going to always experience Uzbekistan the same way as another woman, and someone of a particular race isn't always going to experience it the same way as somebody from another race. And past experiences also inform how people conceptualize what's happening around them. So Terry was a Chinese-Canadian respondent of mine, and he says, I basically wasn't a visible minority there. So he could easily pass, and this comes in stark contrast to some of the literature which talks about how in many development and humanitarian contexts people feel othered because they look differently, they speak differently, they dress differently. Terry's experience, though, comes in contrast to some South Asian MSF staff, and they talk about endless uncomfortable stares and this kind of like othering, really reminding them of probably the racism that they experienced in their countries of origin already as people of color. Here's an example of how gender operates differently for women in the field. So we have a white woman talking about the custom in Uzbekistan where men like to help women get out of the car. So this white woman said, if you don't do that, you really offend the driver. So she always made sure to do that, to take the hand, and she got really upset when other women didn't do it. But for my Middle Eastern respondent, originally from Syria, she just did her own thing, and she talks about jumping out of the car, carrying things. She even joined the soccer team, and that was really surprising for Uzbek men. So you see here how one thing that's like offensive to one person is just laughed off by another person. In terms of past experiences, we see this as well. So Adele talks about how in Syria growing up, she was used to people walking around with guns and, not people, the state security. So she was totally used to that, but it really bothered some of the other expats that were unfamiliar with that. So past experience is also important. Another thing I noticed is a sense of exceptionality among a lot of people. So this is funny because a lot of people think, oh, I'm so different than all the expats, but the other expat beside them also thinks the same thing. We see this with Max. He said he was so nice, so friendly, so open that he got a lot of perks, like free gym membership in Uzbekistan, some discounts on vodka, this and that. Catherine, she was there for the pilot project, so she felt a lot more knowledgeable about local culture. And Adele said as well, I feel really exceptional compared to other expats because I'm from the Middle East, I understand the culture. So to sum up, my research presents women as mobile professionals in their own right. It talks about people as color, and that's a big deal because most research doesn't acknowledge that people of color do development work, do humanitarian work, are overseas in different capacities. And I wanted to as well show that that moral stress can expand and include non-work situations. So I think it's useful going forward for aid agencies to introduce this concept of moral stress, if it's not already discussed, to people that are going overseas so that they understand that that's something that arises. And having discussions in situ is also really important because having everything cash doesn't really help people deal with their issues. Matthew Hunt, as Lisa mentioned, has developed some really great discussion questions and frameworks for helping people deal with issues that come up in the field. But I think beyond that, on a practical level, aid agencies can have a little bit more frank discussions. So when it comes to race, saying that, I don't think that it's acknowledged as much as it should be. So skin color, dress, and mannerisms will make you stand out, that's a given. But going beyond that, you might find it a challenge no matter what color your skin is because of those stereotypes. But at the same time, people of different races will experience it differently. So like Terry, who's Asian, he was able to pass. And I think knowing that information can be useful for people of various races going into the field. Same with Adele being Arab and having that kind of cultural insiderness made her very comfortable. Gender as well, something I think agencies could go a bit more to talk about is saying that, yes, like women, we live in a patriarchal society here, but going to another country, you encounter different forms of sort of patriarchy. So understanding that women may struggle more because of constraints is an important point to mention, as well as what is the role of men in this? Can expat men support expat women in kind of navigating these different forms of culture? And then pre-departure, MSF already does that, try to connect expats who've been in country back to people who are going there for the first time. They should definitely continue doing this. Everyone mentioned that this was a great idea. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. My name is John, and I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and Lisa, I really enjoyed your presentation this morning, so thank you. It sort of informed my thinking since I'm hearing these presentations. Matt and Emily both had excellent projects, and they seem really interesting. Emily, your project's a little more familiar to me than Matt's. But Matt, I learned a lot from it. To be honest, I had to Google international health policy research funding agencies. I wasn't sure quite what would constitute that, but your presentation helped. And what I think your study is really important for highlighting the importance of knowledge translation. I think often as researchers, we're apt to be interested in crossing a certain finish line in research and putting it on the shelf. And we need to incorporate broader ways to communicate our research findings. You pointed out as signals and activities, and I think those are really apt ways to describe how knowledge translation can be communicated. It's when looking at, however, getting information to policymakers in low and middle income countries, we have to be careful about a simplistic understanding of the gaps for why policies are not informed. Often we'll see the cliff analogy, and Matt, you use this, and it's this notion where you have science on one side and policy on another, and there's that gap in between. And that's a helpful way to understand it. But obviously, real life is more complicated than that. The cliff analogy, well, what's in between? It's just empty space, right? It's just air. It seems quite innocuous. But we know in this non-ideal world that we live in, that in fact, there are reasons for that gap that are social and political in nature. And that is not innocuous. And I think that when looking at knowledge translation discussions, we need to raise these issues and frame our assumptions about what knowledge translation can accomplish, and what is the role of funding agencies in informing policies in low and middle income countries, and to what extent are we just reinforcing neo-colonial structures. I can think of a few examples examples, UNICEF has been calling for the elimination of school fees for decades as a policy. It's been agreed upon by a lot of member states, but it's still not been enforced. It's not an issue that people don't know what policies are necessary. They know what they need often in low and middle income countries. They can't implement them because of structural injustices, things like the economic policy environment such as neoliberalism. And so these critical analysis come into play. So I encourage you, when you continue your studies in knowledge translation and funding agencies, that you look at these sort of macro social climates that your work falls under. So thank you, Matt. And I did write some more notes. I'll be sure to send them to you. Emily's work is a little more in line with my own, and I might even recognize some of your research participants. Emily's research question asks, how do race and gender affect individuals doing overseas aid work? And the question assumes, and rightly so, that race and gender play important roles in determining our experiences and in shaping how we perceive these experiences. This is well supported by feminist theories expressing the notion of intersectionality. And Emily, have you looked at intersectionality in your work?
In my spare time, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Because it's right on point. And so intersectionality argues that socially constructed concepts such as gender, race, class, ability, sexual orientation, and other sectarian axes of identity, they interact on multiple levels and simultaneously. These lived experiences are divergent, so they define us as individuals. However, perhaps paradoxically, lived experiences are also unifying. Shared experiences define us as communities and as cultures. Shared experiences of oppression and structural violence elicit collective responses, and we see this now in the Black Lives Matter movement and the I Don't Know More movement. Emily's study demonstrates intersectionality in the experience of international humanitarianism. How humanitarianism field worker is experienced, how the work itself is experienced, and how these experiences are perceived involves race and gender dynamics. This has important implications for our understanding of moral distress in this field. Emily's presentation has shown how traumatizing experiences, such as witnessing bride kidnappings, are highly personal experiences. How we perceive traumatizing experiences is a factor of our personal histories and identities. Clearly, the relationships are dynamic and complex, requiring a more sophisticated explanation than simply a unidirectional cause and effect relationship. In humanitarian aid work, traumatizing experiences are very often shared. Often, others in the team will have experienced the same or similar traumatic event. There's a growing body of work, including the work done here by Lisa and the Humanitarian Health Ethics research team. It's looking at moral distress and how expats turn towards their team for support and guidance. Therefore, to mitigate moral distress requires a safe space to voice and share traumatizing experiences, a space to offer and to find comfort. So this is what we can call a moral space, and it can occur on its own spontaneously, and it often does. And some of my colleagues here today are experienced field workers, and I'm sure you found this, where there's this moral space just occurs naturally, and it's not forced, and it's very therapeutic. However, we need something better than that, because often it's not going to be spontaneous. We need, and this is a role, I think, for aid organization policies, to actually make this a deliberate moral space, intentionally. Emily's study is commendable for acknowledging the multi-ethnic nature of expats. This dominant Western humanitarian aid sector has been justifiably criticized for maintaining and perpetuating race, gender, and class divisions, particularly power imbalances between expats and national staff. It has been described as a form of neo-colonialism, and it's fair, I think, to criticize the dominant forms of humanitarianism in this way. However, we must remember its main purpose, and it has also been described as a liberating force within the notions of cosmopolitanism, that we're all just, fellow partners on this planet, and also the Without Borders movement, that, people should have a right to health care regardless of where they live and the circumstances that they're in. So this important consideration is that international humanitarianism is an unfinished project. And increasingly, it will be defined and strengthened by inclusivity and diversity. That's all I have to say. Thanks very much.
Okay, so it's cutting close to lunchtime, but not quite. So hang in there, and we'll have a short health break for about 10 minutes or so. So we'll be back at around